Hi everyone, this is Miss Braxton, and I am back giving you our notes for the founding of our United States government. So these are all of the notes that are going to cover what exactly went down at the Constitutional Convention. And this is one of my favorite topics to talk about. This is going to seem a little bit familiar to you because you've all taken US history at this point, and so I think you're going to be able to connect some of the dots between US history and AP Gov today. So, this idea of having a governing document for a country goes back quite some time before, this actual constitutional convention happened. And we see a lot of things that show up in our Constitution and in our Bill of Rights. We've kind of borrowed that from other governing documents, like the Magna Carta back in 1215, right? So this idea of like a trial by jury and like no unjust punishment, all of these things, came from an English heritage, right? Where we had these kings who were basically able to just like throw people in jail for no reason, or just be like, I need more money, I'm gonna tax you a whole bunch, right? So the Magna Carta fixed some of these problems, and we are going to use some of these concepts as we are thinking about what we want our country to be and the rights that we want people to have. And so we see these show up in our Constitution and in our Bill of Rights, right? The English Bill of Rights has, again, some things that look really familiar, right? No taxation without representation, right? So this idea that people should vote, or that we should have a legislative body that votes if we want to tax or raise an army, right? This idea of like free and fair elections, the ability to petition government, all of these rights that we have, again, we have seen appear before, and so our founding fathers thought, hey, these are good things to add into our documents. On top of the fact that a democracy was not super new either, right? So you have this Mayflower Compact way, way, way back at the beginning of the colonies, right? Where we have a government that's established basically by the people. And we know that the Virginia House of Burgesses was actually, and still is, the oldest democratic body or legislature in the country. The House of Burgesses today being the still existing in the form of the General Assembly, right? This is actually still a thing today. And each colony and state had their own state and colonial constitutions. So this idea that we should have a big constitution that covers the entire United States, it's not coming from nowhere. 1776, we get the Declaration of Independence. We have all of these great ideals about men being created equal, even though we know they're kind of not really, it's not super something that they believed in. But this idea of inalienable rights and life and liberty and the pursuit of happiness, right? And this idea that governments get their power from the people. All of this had already been written down in the Declaration of Independence. So at this point, we're trying to think about how we can extend this and give people the rights and kind of the ability to exercise these ideals in a concrete way. And how can we incorporate these ideas into our Constitution? We know the Articles of Confederation didn't really work out that great. And you can take a moment to think about the strengths of it, right? Okay, so like states had a little bit more power, were actually a lot more power, right? States were pretty much independent, and you can think of how that could be a good thing, right? Because the people in Georgia have completely different needs and wants than the people in New York, let's say, right? So the Articles of Confederation gave some leeway for that, but we know that there are a ton of weaknesses, right? Like Congress can't tax, they can't raise an army, our money was worthless. All of the things that we talked about in the Articles of Confederation notes are a huge problem, right? And we know that it's Shays' Rebellion that really highlights a lot of those problems. So we gotta do something else. The Articles of Confederation are not working for us. So we get the Constitutional Convention. Oh my gosh. Okay, so just close your eyes for a second. I want you to think and imagine it's the middle of summer. You're in a room with a whole bunch of people. It's hot. You're sweating. It's 1787. There's probably no deodorant, right? This is a super secret event that happens. They didn't even keep the windows open, guys. Like, this is how secret this convention is, because what you're gonna get is a whole bunch. Just imagine right now, right? Like, if there was just a group of elite people in the United States who were like, hey, we're just gonna get together and make a whole new document and completely change the way our countries run because we don't like the constitution that exists right now. Like, that is what was happening, guys. So this is a really radical event. This is super secret. This is not something that they want average people to know about, because this is like so huge. They are literally about to rewrite the way that the United States operates and does everything. So this is a huge deal, guys. Constitutional Convention. What's going down? Well, the number one purpose of this convention was to revise the Articles of Confederation because they weren't working out very well, as we've already discussed. There were 55 delegates. So 55 people, guys, 55 people are going to make the country like new again, basically. Crazy. So 12 states. Now you're thinking like, but there were 13 states. Well, Rhode Island wasn't going to have any part of it because they were like, hey, we don't agree with this. This is not the most democratic thing in the world. They kind of were like, this seems fishy. We're not going to participate. So 12 states, not 13. And now you're going to think, who was there? All of these people look super duper familiar to you. Probably there are founding fathers, but there were a few founding fathers who were not there. Thomas Jefferson was in France. John Adams was in Britain. He was our the minister to Britain or whatever, you know, the ambassador, whatever. Samuel Adams was suffering from liver damage at the time. Fun fact. Samuel Adams, thinking about the beer, right? Not going to say much about that. Patrick Henry literally did not show up because I think his exact words were that he smelled a rat in Philadelphia. So Patrick Henry was also of this idea that like, hey, we shouldn't be doing this. He wanted no part in it. George Washington presided over the entire thing. We're going to talk about Federalists and Anti-Federalists. George Washington was pretty much neither. And so he was a good, a good person to stand in because he didn't have super strong opinions about the direction that the country should go in. So he wasn't really on anyone's side. Therefore, he was on everyone's side and was chosen as the person who's going to preside over this entire convention. And we just said, people always get James Madison and Thomas Jefferson mixed up. Thomas Jefferson, Declaration. James Madison, father of the Constitution. I just said how, Jefferson was in France. So there was no possible way he could be the father of the Constitution. Just remember that when you're thinking about who wrote what. So it is James Madison who writes the Constitution. There were a few issues that were causing some problems here. The first one was this debate between large and small states and how they would be represented. Now remember, back under the Articles of Confederation, every single state, regardless of size, got one vote in that unicameral legislature. Remember? That didn't make large states happy because they're like, hey, how come we, who have 1 billion people, not really, get the same vote as like a state like Rhode Island or whoever who has like 13 people? I don't know. So that was a problem. States' rights versus a strong national government, right? One of the things that states loved about the Articles of Confederation was how states had so much power to control what happened in their own state. But there were other people who were like, hey, we need a stronger national government. We need to band a little bit more together and give more power to the federal government so that we can fix problems that affect everybody more easily. And then this idea of not even about the power of the chief executive, but whether we should even have one. We have a chief executive, we know now, it's the president, but think about back then how that would make people so uneasy because we have just had King George, who was not great, right? So it's like, why are we going to give power to one man again? And how, if we give him power, are we going to limit that power so that he doesn't become a tyrant like King George? And last, and in their minds, definitely least, slavery. Are we going to talk about it? Are we going to fix it? Are we going to leave it alone? What's the issue with the slaves? We don't know. So we'll get to all of these things Now, the Virginia Plan. This was made to kind of figure out representation and trying to solve this idea between like big states, small states. So the Virginia Plan was basically definitely favored by all of the big states, and here's why. Well, it did provide for an executive branch, and it came up with this idea of, okay, a bicameral legislature, right? Before we had a unicameral legislature, and the Virginia Plan allows for two houses. So it said we would have a House of Representatives elected by the people, and the Senate elected by the House of Representatives, and a judicial branch. So this does solve the problem of like interstate disputes, right, which was a huge issue under the Articles. Now, the New Jersey Plan, here we go. This was favored typically by smaller states, and you'll see why. This does kind of lend itself again to this idea of a really weak executive, where we are more of a federation of states, and equal vote per state, regardless of population. This is why the small states like it, right? Because everybody gets the same amount of say, and small states like New Jersey are not going to be, completely, like rolled over by big states like Virginia, who would get more representation because of their population. And this goes back to the idea of a unicameral legislation similar to under the Articles, where there would just be one house, one state, one vote. And several executives. So this idea that we wouldn't just have, like one executive, but there would be several of them. Basically, we get a combination of both of these things. And thinking about what we have in our government today, they did stick with this idea of a bicameral legislature. So two houses. And this two-house system is going to please both the large states and the small states. You have the lower house, which is the House of Representatives, based on representation on population, right? So this makes the large states happy because they get more representation in the House. To please the small states, you got the Senate. So everybody gets the same representation in the Senate. That's 2 votes per state in the Senate. We have 2 Senate representatives for every state. So that's the compromise there. And we know that we do get, the judiciary, and we do get the executive. Now, they waited pretty much, well, we'll wait to talk about slavery. But they had to figure out, before they even got to slavery, what is the situation with slaves? And how do enslaved people count for representation purposes, right? Big states in the South had a lot of enslaved people in them. And the people in the North, those smaller states, were saying, hey, you guys have so many slaves. The slaves, you don't even treat them like freaking people, right? They don't have any rights. Why should you be able to count them for representation when they are not actually afforded any of the rights that would be granted to them by any laws that we were to pass, right? On top of the fact that for those northern states that were smaller, it seemed like enslaved people were like basically inflating the representation of those bigger states, giving them more power, right, in Congress, which is true. So we they came about with this idea of a 3/5 compromise. So slaves were not going to count as one whole person. They would count as 3/5 of a person. And that is how you are going to calculate enslaved people for the purposes of taxing and for representation. Yeah, I know. Blech. So there we go. And the idea or the issue of abolishing slavery in the United States, they saved this for the end of the entire convention. So by this time, people were tired. It was, again, hot. It had been months at this point, and they just said, hey, listen, we can't deal with this. This will possibly undo all of the progress we've already had because these southern states will just opt out, right, if we continue to push this. So they said, hey, we're not going to deal with the issue of slavery. The people who come after us can deal with it because it's just going to make things so much more complicated. Plus, they saved it till the end. They were tired. They want to go home. So, ... to be continued. The Electoral College. Okay, So this is in the Constitution, right? The founders really did not trust the average person to elect the president directly. So they were like, how can we make it so that we're like democratic, but that the people that we want to vote will actually have more of a say. So there's this idea that, okay, we'll allow, at this point, white males who own land to vote, but we're going to allow them to vote. That'll be the popular vote. But there will be electors from each state that will cast votes. And so we think of these electors today as the Electoral College. And the number of electors from each state will equal the number of House seats and the number of Senate seats. So the number of House plus the Senate will equal the numbers of electors that each state will have. So again, this does kind of favor larger states. They'll get more representation in the Electoral College, but you know, no state will ever have less than 3 electors. Now, during the convention, there became 2 very clear factions of people. One of them were the Federalists. And if you want to think of the word federal and like the fact that we have federal government, the Federalists wanted a strong federal government. So this means they supported the Constitution, right? They supported this idea that the Articles were not working, that states had too much power, that we needed a stronger federal government. They supported the Constitution that was written, and they were all gung-ho to sign it. Like I said, they wanted that strong central government. And they believed that the Bill of Rights actually didn't need to be added to the Constitution because each state would still have their own constitution, right? So they thought that the Constitution of the United States would just apply to, you know, the United States. And that any state that wanted to give additional rights to their citizens, I mean, like all of those rights would be covered in those state constitutions, so there was no need to add it to the actual federal constitution. And the big name Federalists that you need to know were James Madison, the father of the Constitution, John Jay, and Alexander Hamilton, who published the Federalist Papers. If you watched Hamilton, you saw him doing that. The Federalist Papers were basically just like 85 essays saying all of the reasons why the Constitution should be passed and why it was a good thing. Now, the ever creative with their name Anti-Federalists were literally the opposite of that, right? So they opposed this Constitution. They thought that we should not be doing this in secrecy, right? That seemed so incredibly undemocratic, and that this Constitution took really important powers from the state, right? These were people who were all about states' rights, who wanted those strong state governments that we found in the Articles of Confederation, and more than anything, they wanted the Bill of Rights. So they wanted this provision, right? So if you think about the Bill of Rights today, right? The freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, you know, trial by jury, all that good stuff, they wanted that attached to the document that was going to say what the federal government could and couldn't do, right? They thought, okay, well, if states have their own Bill of Rights, that only tells the states what they can and cannot do to the people. They said, we need something that is going to protect people from the federal government because, you know, they wanted to limit the power of the federal government because they're anti-federalists and they want more states' power, right? It kind of makes sense. Well, oh, and by the way, the Anti-Federalists said they're not signing the Constitution until or unless there is a Bill of Rights attached to it. So the Constitution is ratified in 1788. You know, this does get passed, and guys, this is the same document that we have today, right? 1788 to 2020. We've changed it a few times, but holy cow, right? Like, is that not amazing that we are still, I mean, some people think it's not amazing and that we should make a new constitution. We'll talk about how that could happen later, but it's kind of bananas, right? That this is ratified in 1788 and now we still have the same document, and we know that because it was ratified, those anti-federalists got what they wanted. They got the Bill of Rights that is added in 1791. That Bill of Rights explicitly prohibits the federal government from abridging all of the rights that you see on the screen now. And those are the first 10 amendments, Bill of Rights, first 10 amendments. and we just kept amending it, and we're still in the process of amending it. So, old document, it's been amended, but there you go. That was the Constitutional Convention.